So thank you. I am so happy to be here. Yes, even at 6 o'clock in the morning here in Louisiana. It's actually perfect because this is the only work I will do today before I get on a plane to go and see my kid who lives in Illinois. So this is a perfect way to start my holiday. The title of my talk is Looking Back to Stay Ahead, Recasting ACT as Behavior Analysis. These are my disclosures. So I run a private practice, I consult, I train, I coordinate a lovely program at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. I've wrote a few
Emily?
books. Yes.
Sorry, we cannot see you on your presentation. Could you maybe see you as well?
I think that might be on your end. I have my video on.
So
I
it's
wonder
on
if there's
our side.
Is there something I need to do differently?
Thanks and sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, no worries. Are we good?
Yes. Yeah, we're fine, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. I do a lot of stuff with ACBS, and I would love to have you reach out if you have any questions about any of that. So I want to first mention, and I suppose this goes without saying, but just kind of as a reminder that everything that I am going to say today, everything that I'm going to do, every facial expression I make, every answer I give to your questions, all of those behaviors are the result or the product of a very specific perspective, my perspective. They're a result of all of this learning history behind me, of conversations with teachers, of conversations with students and colleagues, of sitting in room after room after room with clients or with clinicians learning. And that all of those experiences have created this very particular view on our topic today on acceptance and commitment therapy, and more broadly, how to be with other humans in the room in this really very odd position we find ourselves in as therapists, where we can peek into people's most intimate aspects of their world and hope to facilitate their thriving there. You also come here with your own unique perspectives that are a product of all of your conversations, all of your experiences in the therapy room and in trainings. And I want to acknowledge that my hope is that those perspectives might intersect in a way that is useful to you. I don't speak for anyone else except me. And my hope is that you can receive this in a way that honors your experience. I also want to say what I mean as effective, what I'm thinking of in terms of being effective. And what I'm thinking of particularly is that I would like to offer you something that's like a compass in the room. In the therapy room, I'd like to offer you a framework that you can use to check in and ask yourself, what for me is the most important question? Am I creating that context in this moment for my client to thrive, not just here, but in all of the most significant places in their life? Is that what I'm doing right now? Of course, there's many ways you could answer this question, but I'll offer you just one. So I want to start by sort of contextualizing this work within a broader movement, and that's the movement of process-based therapy. So process-based therapy is hot right now. It is all the rage. It's what is most popular, both in terms of what's selling as trainings and a product, but also in research. On the empirical end, traditionally we've been, I think, as empirically oriented clinicians, we've been really interested in taking kind of diagnostic categories or demographic features or cultural distinctions and sort of pairing those with packages, brands, acceptance and commitment therapy, or cognitive processing therapy. Recently, though, and over the past 5 or 10 years, we have become increasingly oriented towards process, towards this idea that it's not about clarifying a particular package and matching that package to a particular aspect of the client. That instead, what we might be best at using our science for, what might be best to use our science for, would be determining what the mechanisms of healing are, how it is that people get stuck, what are the mechanisms or processes there, and how it is that they heal, and how it is that we can facilitate that healing through the therapeutic process. This is exciting, I think, for clinicians, whether or not you've been to a process-based, training. The fact that this is where the science is right now should be exciting for all of us that spend a chunk of our time doing therapy. And the reason why is that this now focuses on providing us with things that we can look for in the therapy room, things that we can track, ways that we can understand what we are doing in any moment, really. And this should be particularly exciting for CBS clinicians, for cognitive behavioral science oriented clinicians, those of us who do ACT or functional analytics psychotherapy, clinical RFT, because for us, we've always been interested in what those mechanisms are. In fact, it was some of our founders that brought that question and really forced it into the CBT world. It's also exciting for us because it's consistent with some of our most precious or dear philosophical foundations because of functional contextualism. See, we are sort of grounded historically in, quite famously, in Stephen Pepper's distinctions among different worldviews in science. And what Stephen Pepper suggested is that across all sciences, all scientific disciplines, across all specific theoretical perspectives, that he could sort of see patterns in how they looked at the world. He further suggested that if we have inconsistencies in these worldviews, it's quite difficult to foster any collaboration. It's quite difficult to foster any integration of science done from these different worldviews. His suggestion, in fact, was that they are so fundamentally different that we'll have trouble even understanding each other across those scientific kind of islands. So he suggested that these worldviews vary across 3 dimensions. They vary across a root metaphor. And by a root metaphor, he just meant a symbol or a metaphor that we can use to sort of understand everything, that we can apply to anything that we study. He also said that our worldviews are distinguished on the idea of whether we think that the whole is primary and the parts, the little distinctions that we make and the relations among those different parts that we peel out, whether those are secondary or whether the parts are primary and the wholes are what we abstract or construct as scientists. He also said, and we'll spend the most time with this one, that those worldviews differ in how we evaluate the stories that we tell about the world. And when I say stories, I mean from the most complex story, a grand theory about how something in the world works, all the way down to our simplest stories, the labels that we use, for example, to describe the things that we study. So the way that we evaluate those stories and what we call true, Pepper said, was one of the things that distinguish those world hypotheses, our worldviews. And of course, you might be aware that our particular worldview happens to land in what Pepper called contextualism. Now, contextualism, if we walk through those three distinctions, contextualism uses as the root metaphor the act in context, right? So even outside of the behavioral sciences, the idea of an act is that it's an event that's unfolding, that nothing, according to this metaphor, nothing is steady and unchanging, that it's an act, it's unfolding, it's changing. And that act, that event can only be really understood in terms of its context. That just kind of honing in on that event itself, whatever it is that's the subject matter of our science, that just honing in on that event in and of itself won't give us a full understanding of even what it is that we're observing, let alone how it works or how we might impact it. You might think of a vase that's as defined by the space inside of it and around it as what actually comprises the vase itself. So for Pepper as well, or for contextualists as well, the whole is primary. I want you to stop and think about what this means. If the whole, the everything, the multiverse, if that is what is primary, then that means every time we use a term, every time we peel something out from the whole and name it, right? Here is a stimulus, here is major depressive disorder, even there is the client and here am I, that we're peeling apart a whole, we're abstracting individual events because it works for us to do science of it. But that, all of those distinctions are really a product, again, of the context in which that distinguishing happens, right? For Pepper, finally, and you may have heard me hint at this, what is true, right? What is real, the criteria that we use to evaluate our terms, our hypotheses, our theories, our diagnoses, our conceptualizations, all of how we talk about our work, that the way that we evaluate that as true or not true is based on successful working. It's based on the extent to which it allows us to be effective in the world. And so these truth criteria, right, for us, it's successful working. But if we pause for a moment and acknowledge some of the other ways that we approach truth, for many of us, this is not how we approach truth in most situations, right? If I ask my husband if the garbage truck is coming today, I expect his answer to reflect something in the world. I expect it to correspond with what is actually happening. And not only that, but I expect it to cohere. I expect it to make sense with other things he said. If he said the garbage truck comes on Wednesday and today is Tuesday, and he says, yes, the garbage truck is coming today, there must be some other fact to make those statements cohere. So Pepper acknowledged correspondence and acknowledged coherence as other ways that we can evaluate what is true in how we construct our events about the world and what is not true. And of course, we could never, ever abandon coherence or correspondence theories of truth. It's how we use language all day. It's how most of the rest of science works. But in contextualism, we're going to emphasize that last possibility. We're going to include correspondence, of course, because we can't help it. We're going to include coherence because, of course, we can't help it. But our primary way of evaluating truth will be in terms of its working. Now, I want to spend a little bit more time on this because traditionally, the way that we would evaluate a theory or a term, a conceptualization with a client is as if it were a mirror. Right? We would ask ourselves, and this is sort of the correspondence theory, we would ask ourselves, does it match the world? Is it accurately reflecting the world? And this can feel like a really important question, right? To the extent that we acknowledge that we can't actually sort of fully perceive what's going on all the time, that our sensory capacities are limited, and we come into observation with bias. We have our own perspectives, as I mentioned at the front of this presentation. But the hope here is that the progress of science is that we will gradually, over time, we will work out all of the warps and problems in that mirror so that it can accurately reflect the world. The idea is that if my job were to hammer in this nail, and I knew that I was limited, I could never really see the nail directly. I could never really experience it fully. But my job was to hammer it in, right? But what I could do is angle a mirror, and I could be sure that that mirror was as perfect as possible at reflecting. Then the hope is that that would allow me to work successfully. The problem is, right, if you try to apply a pure approach, a correspondence approach within contextualism, it kind of falls apart. It becomes unworkable. If you stop and pause and remember again that idea that everything, the whole, that everything is primary, and that every little piece that we're peeling out, right, that those are secondary abstractions. They're things we are doing, not necessarily reflecting true distinctions in the world. Then we would have to have as many terms as we have events, as many words for basically everything that ever has been and ever will be in order to perfectly correspond with the complexity in the world. So instead, we set aside that idea of truth or theories as mirrors. We set aside the idea that we're trying to perfect our language so that it can accurately reflect the world, and that only then can we work effectively. Instead, right, we ask ourselves, if I was hammering in that nail, looking in the mirror, knowing that I could never truly see perfectly, could I tell if that was the right hammer? Could I tell if it was weighted correctly, if it was making contact with the nail, and if the nail was gradually going in? In other words, instead of knowing to do, instead of correspondence being the first step to being effective, what if I could orient entirely to being effective? What if I could ask myself, what is the impact that these terms are having in this moment right now? What is the impact of this story, right? Of this conceptualization, of this diagnosis? How is it working for my particular aims, for my role in this relationship? Acknowledging that if you were to come and ask yourself, what is true in this situation or what works, that the answer might be different for you or for any other scientist or for any other clinician. Acknowledging that even the acts of the scientist or the clinician are behaviors in context, and that the best that we can do is to focus on doing in order to know. This is hard. This is a really tough perspective to sort of climb all the way into. Even if you already have some experience with functional contextualism, even if you've been around the CBS world for some time, it's tough because we have this long history of selecting our words, our stories, our answers, or even our questions and our problems, of selecting those based on this idea that all of our thoughts and our language actually reflect the world. We're used to evaluating our observations on the basis to which they correspond and fit together. We can never truly abandon this. But fortunately, we have some fearless leaders who years ago climbed into this perspective and constructed things that weren't at the philosophical level or even at the theoretical level in some cases, but constructed tools that for them reflected that effective action that this perspective brought to bear. Right? We have our founders in acceptance and commitment therapy who created a model that should, if it does its job, that should help to orient us as clinicians in the room to both the theoretical foundations of ACT and the philosophical foundations. We should, by using this approach, by adopting the acceptance and commitment therapy model of psychological flexibility or psychological well-being, right? We should be able to, as clinicians, take that functional contextual perspective. And we could ask ourselves, right, applying our truth criterion of successful working, we could ask ourselves, has this worked? You know, has this way of understanding suffering, remember that process-based, understanding suffering as psychological inflexibility and all its components, understanding health and well-being as psychological flexibility and all its components, and understanding the process of healing in terms of building psychological flexibility and all the skills inherent. Has that worked? You know, has it achieved its goals? And in many ways, the answer is absolutely, right? There are 9,000 members of ACBS right now, just over 9,000. I think we just hit 350 randomized controlled trials. ACT is represented in almost every country and almost every continent. It's actually quite widespread. The question I ask, though, and that I'm here to spend some time asking you to ask, is if it really fosters the best that we can do in the therapy room. Is this way of thinking, is it fostering our best work? I sometimes ask clinicians to think about the piece of work that they're most proud of. And I don't mean a whole course of therapy. Maybe it's just one moment. You know, one of those precious moments where you go, that's everything just changed just then, that you could feel it, that you could see it in the client, and that if you look back, that there was a shift somehow there. Most of us have these moments. And I've had many clinicians tell me that they don't know how to understand those moments in these terms. You know, for me, I actually fear that the answer is no. I fear that these middle level terms that situate themselves between common language and our philosophical and theoretical foundations, that they actually kind of collapse too many distinctions, that they collapse too many things that are important in the world, that middle level terms as a rule tend to take that act, that event that we're interested in studying, and the context around it, and collapse them into one term. That necessarily, this is what mid-level terms do. And that when they do that, you know, at least but in my experience, that we tend to struggle to apply them. We tend to orient towards putting them inside the person. And even if we would object and say, no, of course, I don't mean like a trait or a personality, I want you to see if you can feel how easy it is to do that. This client is fused with ideas about himself, right? This person is avoidant of their own self-doubt. You know, how likely in how we speak are we to then put it inside the person? I would suggest that mid-level terms in general, not just our hexaflex terms, but in general, that what middle level terms do when they collapse context and the event that we're describing, that they actually pull for a correspondence game, is what I call it. That using truth or terms as mirrors. And so I want to think for a moment about how it is that we train ACT when we train from this sort of hexaflex or mid-level term perspective. And my understanding is that oftentimes what we get trained to do is almost like putting together IKEA furniture. I'm wondering now if folks in Israel know IKEA. Is that workable? Yes. IKEA? Okay, wonderful. So if you've ever gotten a piece of IKEA furniture, the manual is brilliant. Just a little bit of appreciation for IKEA manuals. Okay, as soon as you open it, you know everything you've got to work with in that moment. As soon as you open it, you know all of the pieces of hardware, the little bolts and screws and nails. It even comes with its own tools. So you've got little Allen wrenches and bits that you're going to use to assemble. You've got these pieces of wood, and the manual lays out every variable you're going to have to worry about to ultimately produce your loft bed or coffee table. Right? Everything is right there laid out. And not just that, but along the way, they hardly even have words in it, right? Are there these images of exactly what you need to do, right? To take this piece and to plug it in exactly there. It even has non-examples, right? Do not put that bolt in that other hole, put it in this hole. Don't use the 4-inch one, use the 2-inch one, right? And at every step, you can stop and compare your half-built bed to the images right there. You can see at any point if you've made a mistake in what you're doing or if you're approaching the product you intended. And a lot of times we train ACT like this, right? Like as if at any point you should be able to pause and check and see where you're at with regards to the manual or the protocol, whether the person is doing what they should be doing based on that manual, right? We almost act as if you can lay out all the variables ahead of time, know exactly what they are and what they're going to look like. If we think about how this might work in the therapy room, I think what this pulls for is for us to play what I'm going to call a correspondence game, where we are constantly checking, right? We're constantly checking what we're seeing in the room against some idea we have about what we should be seeing, where we find ourselves attending to what the client is doing and paying attention then to an idea, comparing it to an idea, right? What's happening between us and paying attention and comparing it to an idea, or even what we're doing and comparing it to an idea, right? Does this fit the diagnosis? Is this an attachment issue? What is this client avoiding? You know, am I being a good ACT therapist? Is this what Kelly would do at this moment? I want you to pause. I want you to consider how many times over the course of a session you might find yourself reaching back to compare what's happening in the room to some idea, right? To some theory, some term, some category, or some conceptualization. And of course, most of us do not want to be in our minds over the course of therapy. We can't help it much, right? We can't help playing the correspondence or the coherence game, but there is an alternative, right? When I've watched some people that I consider masters in ACT, they're not putting together IKEA furniture, right? Instead, it's more like throwing pottery. There are just as many variables. It doesn't really look like it. Like when you look at it, all you kind of see is maybe a little bit of water, a few tools, a lump of clay, a table, your hands, right? But in effect, the things that would impact what you're going to actually do from one moment to the next with the clay are dependent on tons of things that we can't necessarily see just by looking at it. It matters what the composition of the clay is, right? What minerals are in the clay and how finely it's ground. It matters what the temperature in the air is, right? So even a thing I didn't name before, the air around it certainly matters as to how moving my thumb this way would impact the clay. And not only that, but with my hands involved, lots of things about my functioning matter, my body temperature, my dexterity, maybe how much I typed or played ukulele yesterday will matter as to how finely I can move my fingers, right? And not just that, but if we really let ourselves imagine, there's things that are not even here and present to be observed that certainly matter how I need to interact with the clay. Things like, if we stretch all the way back to its history, like where it was dug out of the ground, or what organic matter was included in it, or what those beings were up to right before they died and became the components of this clay that became eventually, a piece of medium for me to work with. And not only that, but most potters, if you ask them, will tell you that it's not always clear what a piece of clay is going to be before you start to work on it. It's not always obvious what the shape of its finest manifestation will be, but that some pieces of clay were never going to be a fine vase or a thin, delicate sculpture. And some pieces of clay were never going to be a low, sturdy, thick bowl. They'll tell me that it's only in interacting with the clay, it's only in putting their hands on it, getting it moving, adding a little bit of water, seeing how that works, starting to move their fingers and to work with the clay to get it loose and ready, right? It's only in that process, and even the process of it sort of crumbling and folding and collapsing under their hands so they can gather it back up again and start once more, that it's through that process that they know. It's not knowing in order to do, it's doing in order to know. And when I watch people that are incredibly fluent in ACT and in other contextual behavioral scientific approaches, when I watch folks in the room that I think of as masters, it doesn't look like putting together IKEA furniture. It looks like art. I'll watch them do something and I'll watch the client respond in a way that surprises me, and it feels like art. Right? They're interacting, they're observing, they're doing what I call playing the function game, where instead of comparing what's happening in the room to some idea, right, they are attending carefully to that relationship between everything they're doing and everything the client is doing. They're watching what happens here, what happens here. And if I do this, what can the client do with this context now introduced? In this perspective, the therapist acknowledges that they are the context and the client's behavior is the act, and comes to understand everything that's unfolding in the client's behavior in that immediate context. From this perspective, when we're playing the function game, right, we might not always know exactly what it would look like for the client to truly thrive. We might not know exactly how they will change, right? But we have a sense of what thriving is functionally. And we can check in every moment, am I creating a context for thriving? Right? Is that what I'm doing right now? Is the client getting an opportunity to practice thriving? And are we doing that in the context that most matter for the client's life? I call this playing the function game. And my suggestion is that in any one moment, we can stop and notice, am I playing the correspondence game? And if I am, I can come back to playing the function game, simply by asking myself, what is the client doing now? And how is it related to what I'm doing? Or what am I doing now? And how is it related to what the client is doing? Or the more simple question of what are we doing now? We might acknowledge for a moment that this idea of playing the function game is actually embedded in our theoretical foundations, right? We happen to be in a subdiscipline where our theory is firmly grounded in that philosophy of functional contextualism. You know, this is a whole approach to science that's based on the function game right there in behavior analysis. And I want to stop for a moment because I think this is where some people have gotten stuck. Behavior analysis, yeah, the language isn't very, very friendly. It tends to be a little jargony. And honestly, behavior analysts, we can sometimes be a little bit rigid with our terms, wanting people to use them with a level of precision that sometimes isn't even workable. So I'm going to offer a simple way of taking a behavior analytic perspective in the room. I'm going to suggest to you that every term in behavior analysis boils down into three basic categories, two primary. That's context, behavior, and function. So in other words, the job of behavior analysis is to divide the world, that whole, into behaviors. That's what gets our attention. Those are our dependent variables, right? That's what ultimately we are responsible for fostering change in, is behavior. The context, right? That which surrounds it, that which we can manipulate and directly influence. And function, the relationship between context and behavior. And I want to say a little bit more about what I mean by those terms. And that's because I am deeply influenced by an interbehavioral perspective or a Kantorian perspective that lets go of some of the rigidities that are present in radical behaviorism. And that recently has been suggested, interbehaviorism has been suggested as an alternative philosophical foundation for contextual behavioral science. First, with behavior. Instead of thinking of behaviors as single events that are distinct from other behaviors, other events, I like to think of behavior as a behavioral stream. Right now, you are engaged in an infinite number of things, functionally infinite. You are thinking, you are listening, you are breathing, you are sitting. We could also zoom out and say that you are communing with your community, with your colleagues. I hope we could say that you are learning. I hope we could say that you are puzzling or hoping. We could also zoom in on one part of you. Maybe you've had lunch and you're digesting, right? And we could look at your brain chemistry, right? Any part, anything that you do is behavior. And so if we think of that broad behavioral stream, that all of those things that we would call individual behaviors, we can think of as currents in the stream. Right? They're certainly smashing together and impacting one another. There are relationships among those currents, right? And those behavior relationships are of particular interest to us at times, right? But for us as behavior analysts, we're not going to call the relationship between two currents in the stream, we're not going to call those causal relationships. We're not going to say this behavior causes this other behavior, this thought caused this behavior, or this feeling caused this behavior, or even this diffusion caused this behavior, right? Instead, right, we look for the causes, and I'm going to put those in quotes, we look for causes of behavior, workable causes, outside of the behavioral stream. We look to aspects of context because those are things that we can manipulate. We are present in the client's context. And indeed, everything that we observe directly from the client is indifferentiable from our presence as an observer. And not only that, but of course, we do more than observe. Right? So when we understand behavior, we're going to understand it in terms of the context in which it occurs, in terms of everything outside of the behavioral stream. And we can't account for everything. There's would be an infinite number of distinctions we could make. So we're going to focus on the aspects of context that we can directly manipulate, things that we can push on to determine the relationship between context and behavior. And indeed, that's how I would define our third term, function, as the relationship between context and behavior. That tension or tether, where when context changes, behavior changes, and when behavior changes, context changes. So if someone asks, what is the function of a behavior? What they're really asking is, what is the context in which this behavior occurs? And if they ask, what is the function of a context? We're really asking, what are the behaviors that occur in this context? You might pause and notice some of the ways that we use function that are not that. What does it mean? Or what does the client want? Or how are they motivated? And in some cases, those point us to functional relationships between context and behavior that we can then push on. But in some cases, it doesn't. Right? In some cases, those are not workable uses of the word function. So how does this apply in the room? How it applies in the therapy room is that we then can take a clinical behavior analytic perspective, right? We can entertain the idea that all we need to attend to in the therapy room is the ongoing stream of behavior, and that we are part of the analysis of that ongoing stream of behavior. In fact, the implications are that we watch the client behave in this long, dynamic stream. It's constantly changing from one moment to the next. We watch as their learning history becomes present in the moment, right? We watch as they engage in the behaviors that cause them suffering or that are their suffering. That's those same behaviors that they engage in out in the room. We understand the therapeutic process in terms of that functional relationship between what we are doing and what the client is doing. And it's our job to make present in the context, to make psychologically present or behaviorally present, functionally present, the things in our clients' lives that are most important to them. This is what I call as clinical behavior analysis. And in other words, I think our job in the therapy room from this perspective is to make pottery. This could be overwhelming, I think, in part because if function is the relationship between context and behavior, and there's an infinite number of things that could potentially be context, and there's an infinite number of behaviors that we could peel out, then it serves to reason that there could be an infinite number of ways that we could understand or describe function. But I'm going to give us two, right? Just one distinction, just one discrimination that we can use as a tool in the room. And this should not be particularly surprising because this distinction is actually consistent with those categories or ends of the continuum of flexibility and inflexibility. I'm talking about aversive versus appetitive functions, right? And so we traditionally, and certainly in some branches of ACT, might think of these as moving toward behaviors. So when the relationship between the context and behavior is that the behavior is about moving towards something. And that actually when folks are moving towards something, it has impacts for their whole repertoire. And we might think of aversive control or aversive functional relationships as those that are about moving away. And we know that moving away from aspects of the context has implications, it has impacts on the whole rest of the repertoire. So let's unpack those just a little bit more, because this is what is, to me, one of the things that is most important in the therapy room. So if we stay with aversive control, it's not just about running, fighting, or hiding, which are some ways that we can think about moving away, right? In some cases, it's hard to tell if it would be best thought of as aversive control or moving away or moving towards. If I put on a sweater right now, am I moving away from cold or am I moving towards warmth? It's unclear unless you look at the level of the whole repertoire. Because what happens, right, when we are engaged in behaviors under aversive control, or when our client's behavior has an aversive relationship with the context we're creating right there in the room, is that we can see the rest of the repertoire shrink. Aversive control is cumulative. Aversive learning accumulates in the repertoire. And like a generalized operant, we become better and better at escaping. We start implementing rules that allow us to escape things before they've even occurred, right? That allow us to imagine new things to escape and to contact those in moments that they're not physically present. We get better and better at detecting aversives. In other words, our context becomes increasingly more aversive the more that our behavior functions aversively. With every instance, in other words, of behavior under aversive control, we get better at aversive learning and worse at other ways of learning. Of course, fortunately, the same thing is true about behaviors under appetitive control. Behaviors under appetitive control include seeking and exploring and engaging. And again, it's not just that. But when we are engaged in behaviors under appetitive control, we are getting better and better at detecting appetitives, at discriminating the behavior needed to access them, and at noticing when the rewards are sort of piled upon us, right? At knowing what to do next. And over time, the more opportunities for behavior under appetitive control that we have, the broader and more flexible our repertoire becomes. You can sort of imagine, I said, these parallel with psychological flexibility and inflexibility. Right, that at any one moment, we can look at the breadth of the repertoire and tell whether the behavior that we are interested in is under aversive or appetitive control. We can look at how easy it is to intervene. Under aversive control, the world is narrow and rigid, but under appetitive control, the world is broad and flexible. We can easily bring behavior under new sources of intervention. We can redirect quite easily and nurture a new skill, right, without much effort at all. Under aversive control, however, right, most things that are unknown or that are novel will function like aversives. And so the job in the therapy room then is to have a perfect combination of both. And this is something we've got to do in order to know. But our job then, from this perspective, is to bring context to bear that foster aversive control, that function aversively, to be able to witness right there in the room the running, fighting, and hiding that is our client's suffering, to evoke that behavior under aversive control, and without letting it go, without removing the aversive, to then add to the context to expand the repertoire. And as we add to that context, we are inviting new behaviors. And with every new behavior that the client practices in the presence of the aversive context that squeezes them down out in the world, right, that produces suffering out in the world, every new behavior that they engage in then in the therapy room is a new behavior that they have at hand out there in the world. My client starts practicing breathing in a way that centers and grounds them. Next time they're in a situation that pulls for the anxiety I can see is present in the room, they will have that breathing accessible to them. If my client practices orienting towards their value of being a mother in the room, right, with their self-deprecating thoughts present in a moment that they are also having self-deprecating thoughts, then next time they are in a context that pulls for self-deprecation, they will have that orienting available. In other words, from this perspective, our job isn't to practice, particular skills and to hope that they match or that they generalize out there in the room. Our job is instead to bring to bear the most important context, both appetitive and aversive, from out in the client's life, and to bring those to bear right there in the therapy room. To evoke behavior under aversive control and to add to the context to expand the repertoire until those aversives no longer function as aversives. Now, of course, aversive control is on a continuum and appetitive control is on a continuum. So just like with pottery, we are constantly watching as the repertoire bulks up and gets big and fat and flexible and shrinks down and becomes narrow and limited, and constantly looking for that sweet spot where there's just enough appetitives to support new learning under appetitive control and just enough aversives that it's going to matter, that what they do with us in the therapy room is going to matter. And of course, we deliver appetitives throughout to strengthen the repertoire. You can do that in a number of ways. There is, of course, our praise, our attention, our affection. I like for this to be sort of baseline appetitives. I like this to be not something that we apply and withdraw, but that is constantly there and that actually makes it possible for us to bring in aversives at all. And instead, I like to think about strengthening the repertoire by, when a client does a hard thing, then giving them the opportunity to contact something appetitive, something pleasant or values consistent, or even an opportunity to engage in a mastered skill, something they've gotten really good at with us, or something that they do really well out in the world. That we're constantly moving between challenging the client and then strengthening the behavior they just used to meet that challenge. And I think that this is all we need when it comes to process or process-based acceptance and commitment therapy. That in any one moment, we can pause and notice when we're playing the correspondence game and instead come back to playing the function game. That we can ask ourselves, right? What is happening right now? What are we doing right now? Is the client's behavior under appetitive control or under aversive control? And if I were to intervene, right, how could I, how is the repertoire in terms of being able to tolerate more aversives? Or do we need to go ahead and shift to some appetitives to strengthen the hard work that the client's just done? I think that actually it's my understanding, and I've been around this work for about 18 years, 19 years. It's my understanding that this was sort of the point of the hexagon model. That the idea is that this is what this would foster, that each of these points on the hexaflex actually represent a relationship between context and behavior, a functional dimension. Kelly Wilson and I wrote about the hexaflex processes this way in Mindfulness for Two. The question is, when they collapse context and behavior and function into all one term, if we just take one, for example, experiential avoidance, right? when there are, painful emotions present, can the client, or in contexts that pull for painful emotions, is the client running, fighting, or hiding in such a way that their repertoire narrows? For most people, just the term experiential avoidance doesn't allow them to look at that in terms of, and then what would I do to challenge the client in this moment to practice the reverse, to practice being able to approach an aversive stimulus, a stimulus that they typically avoid, that pulls for whatever the painful emotions are. Instead, I'm going to suggest some other target behaviors. So we notice when we're playing the correspondence game, we orient back to the function game. We ask ourselves, is the function appetitive or aversive? How aversive or appetitive is the function right now? And then we target particular behaviors. And I'm going to chunk these out into a few categories. The first category for me is all about attending to different aspects of that ongoing behavioral stream. So I invite clients to shift their attention in a flexible way amongst thoughts and feelings and perceptions. So when I get behavior under aversive control and I begin adding to the context, that adding to the context is inviting the client to do these things. It could be big, complex exercises that fit with the hexagon model, or it could be tiny interventions like, is there a memory coming with this feeling? I'm wondering if there are any emotion words that you could use to describe what's happening for you. Can you tell me what's going on in your body? What's your mind saying there? Right? Any of those small little conversational questions for me are incredibly powerful from this model, right? Without sort of breaking my opportunity to observe by having the client sit through an explanation or an education or an exercise, right? I can very quickly probe, can they do this in this context that functions as aversive? In this situation that pulls for anxiety or sad thoughts or painful memories or even dramatic events, in this context that pulls for that, can they shift their attention amongst these different aspects of their behavioral stream? And how much scaffolding do they need? How much support do they need from the environment to be able to do that? For me, the more support, the easier questions to answer, the ones that are more specific. There's a difference between saying what is showing up now and is that anger I see happening for you in this moment. Right, for the second, it's a lot easier to discriminate. And over time, I want to move the client towards fewer and fewer prompts, towards less and less scaffolding, where they are freely moving amongst these different skills. And the aversive event itself is what pulls for them. As we start moving amongst different aspects of our behavioral stream, right, we note some aspects of context that are aversive. One of the things that I want my clients to be able to do is to be able to be aware of aversive stimulation, aware that aversives are present. And in fact, to be able to engage in behavior in which they approach those aversives, right, in which they actually engage in behavior that intensifies their experience with or contact with those aversives. Again, this could be a long exercise. My preference is gentle nudges that allow me to then look and see, can the client do this here? It might be something like, can you name what is here now? I saw something just changed. That might be a probe for awareness. Right? Asking the client to approach an aversive could be something very direct, like, could we sit with that for a moment? I wonder if you could lean in there. It could also be very simple, like, that looks very painful, or ouch, or even a look on your face that enhances their experience of pain. Can they hang with that? Or do they pop out and begin running, fighting, or hiding? Of course, there are some aspects of our experience that are particularly important in terms of how we behave across different aversive contexts. Under aversive control, we tend to experience ourselves and others in very limited ways. So another chunk of target behaviors for me is encouraging people to be able to shift flexibly amongst different experiences of themselves or of other people. Right, again, this could be a complex exercise. It could also be if a client is sharing a memory of themselves, of an event that happened this week. It could be an invitation to, can you really lean in and look at yourself in that memory? I wonder what reactions you have to that version of you. We could also point them to another significant person in their life. And as you tell this story, can you picture your wife in the moment that she was explaining this to you? What are your reactions to her? Now, the target here is to build out those experiences, right? To make them flexible, to introduce them in all their complexity, where ultimately all of the different functions the self or another has can be brought to bear to foster the client's flexibility. And once we have the sort of breadth and flexibility with ourselves and others, a related skill is being able to shift perspective across those different versions of us and those different versions of others. Being able to not just be in a particular perspective, bearing witness on those experiences, but also shifting out of the here and now or I to take the perspective of another person, to take perspective from another situation, to take perspective from another time, right? We might imagine these questions as things like, and if you see that memory of that conversation from your partner's eyes, I wonder what shows up in this moment. Is that accessible to you, right? What does that add? Of course, there would be shifting across person and across time and across situation. We might find it useful to isolate one or two of these. If the you from yesterday could speak to the you right now about the anxiety you're experiencing, I wonder what they would see or say or understand about what you're experiencing now. Or if this suffering, this memory that's taking over right now, if that were to happen at work, if you and I were sitting in your office just before your next appointment, I wonder how that sits differently if we imagine that different context is present. Here we can imagine that with every new perspective that's brought to bear in this moment, that the context further expands. And because of the relationship between context and behavior, that those are of a kind. As we build flexibility in the repertoire, as we build flexibility with behavior, we vary out the behaviors people can engage in. We are varying out their world. We are making their world functionally bigger. And perspective shifting is a great example of that. Of course, we also want people to be able to implement some of these same things that we're training in the room throughout their lives. We want them to be able to watch themselves engaging in the world, to see how their behavior is working. In other words, we want them to be tracking behavior, context, and function in a moment to moment to moment way. And I have this situated in this space in the presentation because for many clients, this is very, very difficult to do well in ways that those functions actually come to bear in this moment, in ways that it's actually tracking and noticing those functional relationships right there in the room. I'll have you notice that this includes basically everything we've talked about so far, being able to attend to different aspects of the experience, being able to shift perspective, certainly, being able to hone in on different aspects of a memory or an imagined event. At its high water mark, this might look like experiential problem solving, where we're able to walk a client up to different possibilities for their behavior and where they can open up to letting those functions come to bear, letting those contexts be psychologically present so they can probe possibilities for their behavior in moments where they're not actually having to make any decision at all. And of course, we do this all with hope that our clients will get increasingly effective at being aware of and able to approach appetitives. This should probably be earlier in the series because, of course, we are working on understanding their behavior under appetitive control throughout the whole therapeutic relationship and are using these appetitives to strengthen all of the other target behaviors we've mentioned, but also we want to build a repetitive learning repertoire to go beyond just relief from aversive control, beyond just things that are pleasant or pleasurable, all the way to overarching values, to the kinds of repertoires that impact people being able to detect and orient towards appetitives in any moment, being able to detect that appetitives are available, being able to discriminate what behavior would allow for access with those, and being able to notice, right, how or if that behavior worked in the ways that they anticipated or not. Being able to refine it over time and getting better and better at living a life under appetitive control or a life of thriving. And we do this, of course, using language. And we have a couple of tools that might be useful that I'd like to share with you. So one is, this is a little contextual piece that for me has helped me to continue to play the function game in the room, to notice when I'm playing the correspondence game and come back to tracking appetitive and aversive control and identifying particular target behaviors. At the bottom right, there's a QR code. And if you find that this might be useful and you'd like to adapt it or use it as is for your own uses, you can take your smartphone and just take a picture, and it should actually pull up Google Drive where I've saved a copy of those flex notes. I'll be happy to make the presentation available to the organizers as well, or you can email me if you'd like a copy and the QR code isn't workable. These flex notes for me are so important to orienting towards what I'm doing in the room. I can tell when I get to the flex notes if I've been distracted or playing the correspondence game. I can tell because I'll get to one of these items, okay, attention to cognitive experience, and I'll ask myself, did they do that? And then I'll have to ask myself, did I give them the opportunity to do that? Right? Or I go, okay, shifting perspective between different times. Okay, did they do that? Did I give them the opportunity to do that? And built into the coding in that second column is whether or not I had to prompt it, or to what extent I had to prompt it. Ultimately, if a client had all fives down the row, what we'd see in the room is that they were sort of wandering amongst different events in their life, things that are aversive and things that are appetitive. And as they're encountering aversive things, they're demonstrating flexibility. They're orienting towards what is significant there and orchestrating behavior that is consistent with a life of thriving for them. With me having to do almost nothing, right? That's how I know our work is done. Or maybe we spend most of our time in experiential problem solving, and all I need to do is introduce the possibility, and then I can watch them navigate towards fattening up their repertoire using that tracking. For me, and if I get behind on my notes, like 2 or 3 days behind, I'll notice that my therapy in that gap is worse, that this is harder. It's harder for me to come back to the function game. So this is a little contextual move that I present in my life to support clinician Emily in playing the function game, and indeed doing the clinical behavior analysis, not just in name, but in practice. I encourage you, if you are interested in this perspective, to download these Flex Notes, to code a couple of sessions to see how it feels. Feel free to change it up, alter it however you want. These are not copywritten. My intention is to provide something that might help you to bring this out into your work. We have reached the end of our time today. We'll break for questions in just a moment. I think what this slide says is that I'm going to be giving a workshop in 2 months now, in 2 months' time. And you can access the details at that link down there at the bottom, or the QR code actually goes to the same place. So if you would like to hear more about what we've talked about today, but with practices at sort of every discrimination, this will be a deeply experiential workshop, right? Every time you found yourself asking, but how would I? That's the time that I'll be in the workshop doing a demonstration and then inviting you into a breakout to practice this new bit that you probably have more questions about than answers. But remember, this model is about doing in order to know rather than knowing in order to do. So I hope that some of you will join me and be willing to jump in. This is my contact information. I'd invite you to reach out if there's anything that you think that I could help you with. If I'm not the person, I will tell you. I'll also say that sometimes my email can get a little bit backed up. So please do not lose faith if you email me and it takes me some time to answer. I will eventually get to it. Ask Leor. And I think now we have a few minutes for questions. I'm happy to take 15 minutes. I'm speaking to the organizers now. I'm happy to take 15 minutes now since we got started a little bit late. But if there's another event that's starting in 5, then I'm also happy to use the more limited time. So thank you all so much for your attention.